Your client sends you a request for quote Friday, 4 p.m. and wants it back by Monday morning. Let me show you how to price it in 2 hours instead of working all weekend using one simple hack, 5 systems, and some strategic tools. The hack to estimating faster is knowing what not to price. If you've got clear drawings, accurate resource rates, and you've priced the same activity 1,000 times, pricing it for the 1,000th and first time is pretty simple and straightforward. You can't price something you've never priced before quickly and accurately. So if you've only got a weekend, you've only got a short amount of time to price something, then price what you know and exclude everything else, or at least delay it. If you can't price the complex HVAC system because you've never done anything like it before, simply exclude it in your letter of offer, price the rest of the project, and then tell your client you need more time to submit that portion of the quote. This way, you're not cutting corners and sacrificing accuracy, you're just strategically pricing when you're time poor. Your client will probably be happy with an 80 to 90% price with a couple of exclusions that they can budget for, then waiting weeks for an accurate price when you've missed your deadline. Now let's talk through the estimating process and look at where time gets wasted, what consumes the most time, and what we can do to speed it up. Okay, so if we work through the overall estimating process, we start with receiving and analyzing the client documents. We then need to create our pricing schedule. We need to then estimate our direct, our indirect costs, put our price together, check and review our estimate, and then summarize and submit. Now, if we look at the 80-20 of where all the time in estimating goes, it really goes into analyzing and understanding the project scope, particularly when clients send you 100 documents, most of them irrelevant, conflicting drawings and specifications, and you just want a clear scope of works and understanding of what to do. And then also step 3, spending all your time compiling your estimates, breaking down activities, measuring quantities, finding resource rates, performing lots of line items and calculations. So biggest time savings we're going to be able to make are in steps 1, analyzing the tender documents, and then 3, compiling our direct costs. All right, step 1, analyzing the tender package. Well, biggest time waster here is where our clients, and all big companies do this, send you a tender package with 50 attachments, most of them irrelevant specification. I was recently working on a concrete tender and the client sent their electrical lockout tagout process. Completely irrelevant and useless. And the irony here is, given the amount of time they're giving you to price it, a team of people wouldn't have enough time to sit through and read all these documents. So it's always shocks me. It's completely unfair that they expect you as the contractor to analyze all these documents and then eventually sign a contract agreeing to them. So that's why whenever I get a tender package, in the first 15 minutes, I want to find 4 things. I want to find the scope of works, which is the description of what they're asking us to quote for. I want to find pricing schedule or the bill of quantities if they've provided one. I want to find the drawing package relevant to our scope of works, and then any key specifications or documents like a schedule that will impact our pricing. Now, I typically do this by just looking at the document names. The big risk here is that you miss an important document that impacts your pricing. That's why when we submit our letter of offer at the end of the tender, when we compile our price, we want to make sure our inclusions and exclusions are explicit. And if we didn't have enough time to go through all the tender documents, we should list on our letter of offer what documents, drawings, and information we've used to prepare the price. If it's not clear, within 15 minutes, call your client. 15 minutes should be plenty of time to get that information from any half-decent tender package. If you call your client and they're not helpful or they're not appreciative of you doing that, it's probably not a project you eventually want to work on. Now, depending on the size of the project, AI tools like ChatGPT can help with simple contract packages, or my estimating software Operum has a function where you can upload complex tender packages and it'll turn it into a simple structured summary. Once we worked out what we're pricing, we can move on to step 2, which is creating our pricing schedule. While step 2 doesn't take that long, it sets up step 3 where we actually build our estimate for success. Now, if our client gives us a schedule or format that they want the quote returned in, we obviously have to use that. The only thing I'd say is just break it down a little bit more so it matches your standard activity groupings. If you're creating your own pricing schedule, then do it based on your standard activity groupings. But how to do this is, before you start the tender, you need standard activity groupings for all the tasks you price. So this means creating an activity library with standard unit rates and breakdowns of key tasks. You want these to be adjustable, so you can only edit one or two variables and it'll change your price to reflect things. For example, if your client is going to free issue materials, you can untick the box that says material supply. If you're placing concrete, you can check whether you're going to use a concrete pump, a boom pump, a line pump, or whether you can place it directly from the AGI, or for example, adjusting key things like the reinforcement density. So it's really about having a standard activity template with the key variables at the top where you can just chop and change things to get an accurate price. So for example, if I'm looking at this as an activity template, it's already got below it concrete placement, reinforcement, formwork, access, scaffold hire. Then at the top of this, I've got all the variables I can adjust, such as the volume of formwork, the volume of concrete, the number of wastage, the number of different reuses of formwork, productivity rate for formwork. Put all this in a template, then it's just a matter of tweaking a few variables when it comes to pricing my direct costs, and then I can spit out a fairly accurate price. Once we've set up our pricing schedule based on our standard activity groupings, next up we can move on to pricing our direct costs, which is where we're going to spend the majority of our time estimating. Now, because we set up our pricing schedule using standard activity groupings, we can then price our direct costs much faster because, as I showed in the last example, all we should be adjusting is key variables and quantities. Now, if you've got really good historical project data, you can use parametric estimating to do this even faster. So for example, if you have an activity to supply and install concrete, you can simply adjust the overall variable. For example, if it's 200 meters cubed, you can make it 300 meters cubed or whatever the volume on your project is. I don't like doing parametric estimating like this because the activity needs to perfectly align with what you're doing and you need very good historical project data. For example, that supply and install concrete rate includes concrete pump, but you don't need it for your project, then you're overstating the cost. So that's why I prefer the activity template method where you go through each activity like supply and install concrete, you have a couple of variables that you could just edit. Now, if you're a general contractor that's using subcontractors to complete the work, you might not have the same activity template breakdowns, but what you will need is a similar sort of rate schedule or rate card from your subcontractors where you can quickly adjust their quantities of work to get an accurate budget price for their task. Now, while I said that this process helps you estimate faster, you'll see that it requires you to spend some time collecting data and setting up systems before you do any estimating, which I guess is the value of why systems matter and why they save you time. Now, the other elephant in the room, direct cost estimating, is measuring quantities. Hopefully your client has given you a detailed bill of quantities which you can just rely on, but if they haven't, you'll need to measure them from the drawings. If you don't have much time, then you can use the 80-20 rule and apply it to measuring quantities and just measure the big quantities and then apply ratios to these. For example, you might have volume of concrete and you apply a standard reinforcement ratio to that volume of concrete, rather than doing a detailed quantity takeoff. Or if you're an electrical contractor, you might count that there's 25 light fittings and you need 10 meters of cable per light fitting rather than measuring all the cabling. Or you can outsource your quantity takeoffs on a platform like Upwork or Fiverr. Now, after you've done your direct costs, you move on to your indirect cost. Even if you're not doing this with the goal of estimating fast, I believe indirect costs should always be plug and play because with indirect costs, the problem is that you miss activities. Therefore, you should have a standard template for all your projects of your standard indirect costs. Then all you're doing to price indirects is ticking yes or no, and you have another variable, which is the duration of the project. So you might have categories like site establishment, site management, utilities, small tools and consumables, bonds, insurance, and warranties. Then you've broken down which of these costs are one-off. If they're one-off, you know the cost of them already. If they're recurring, your only variable is the duration of the project. Now, hopefully your client has given you a project schedule telling you how long the project's going to be. If so, you can include that in your letter of offer that you've relied on their estimate of the project duration to budget for your indirect cost. If they haven't, the quick way to estimate the duration of the project without going through and building up a detailed Gantt chart is to simply use the man-hour method. Basically, what this involves, based on your understanding of the project, if you look at a project and you say, I'm going to run this with an 8-person, 12-person, 20-person crew, you look at the total number of man hours, you divide this by the size of the crew and the number of hours they're working per day to turn that into an indicative program. In my experience, this method tends to be relatively accurate because most projects, people have a good feel on the total resources, the peak number of resources they're going to be using. Then from the man hours and the estimate, you can convert this into a duration. Now, so we've done our pricing, we've got our direct costs, our indirect costs, we've applied our markups and margins on it. The final step in this process is to check your estimate is correct. Now, again, just use the 80-20 rule, or what I tend to find with estimating is it's the 95-5 rule. There's only a handful of line items that will make up the most of the cost, or more importantly to understand, it's typically only a handful of assumptions. Maybe it's a key quantity, maybe you're largely a self-performed business and there's a single productivity rate that's mainly driving your cost. Those are the things you want to check and make sure are accurate. On the other hand, if you don't have a couple of single items that are driving your overall price, that's also a good news, because checking the estimate becomes much more about making sure all the little activities are covered. So if you have an estimate that's perfectly broken down into 25 activities of equivalent pricing, checking your estimate becomes not so much about making sure any individual item is spot on and correct. It's more about making sure the entire scope is covered within that activity set. Now, the hack I'll give you here is that AI can do a very good job at error checking your estimates if you're using the original tender documents and instructions as context. So you can use a tool like ChatGPT, or that is the core functionality that I've built into Opera. So you have to upload Excel construction estimates, get Opera to analyze them, and Opera will indicate what gaps and omissions there are from the pricing. Then once you've checked your errors correct, the final step in the process is to submit your estimate. How do you speed this up? Well, you need a template letter of offer. When you're doing your pricing, you should note down your standard inclusions and exclusions. That also means within your activity template for a task, you want to document what the standard assumptions around that activity are. It's going to be a combination of both understanding and thinking through the task, also just keeping track of your historic projects and what specific commercial issues you've come across. Now, particularly when we're talking about clients sending massive tender packages, the thing I like to do here is where clients send you a ton of information, I'll always list out on my letter of offer what information I've relied on. So in case they've buried a document with some important pricing information within the stack of 100 drawings and specifications I've sent you, I've clearly stated in my letter of offer that this is the information I've relied on. Now, I understand that when it comes to execution, it gets a little gray whether the pricing was based on a letter of offer or their information, but at least it does give you a leg to stand on if arguments do arise later on about specific inclusions and exclusions. But I personally hate the fact that clients send these huge tender packages with unrealistic timeframes to respond to a quote. Everyone knows you can't possibly go through all the information. That's why my letter of offer, I always express in detail what information that they've provided on that I'm relying on.